Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? The show starts in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Well, welcome back, guys. We are joined with Jon from Trinnov Audio today, and we are going to talk about their brand new, soon to be coming to you end users out there, bass management. Jon, why don't you tell us all about it?
Okay. Some people may have seen a webinar that I did a few weeks back, maybe a month now. It was reasonably well received, but in just going through it and delivering it, I figured out there were a few places where I needed to up my game in terms of explanation. So it's going to be a similar presentation, but if it looks real similar, hang in there because there are some better explanations along the way than what I was able to do before. So this is not really a bass management system in the normal sense. Bass management is, redirecting bass from a speaker that won't be able to reproduce it to one that will be able to reproduce it, and typically a subwoofer, but whatever. This is not really defining that so much as it is changing the way bass is reproduced in the room in general. And the goal here is to take on one of the biggest problems that our industry has always had, which is just the problem of standing waves and the fact that rooms dominate the performance of the sound at lower frequencies when the wavelengths become, comparable to the size of the room themselves. So let me get started just with a quick little bit of background in case some people aren't familiar with Trinnov. Our company was founded about 20 years ago to investigate what was possible in terms of better understanding of complex three-dimensional sound fields. And the goal was to improve what was possible in reproduced sound by understanding what was going on better. And our optimizer technology came out of that research. And as a result, its approach is actually quite different than a lot of other approaches to room correction. But here's the catch. When the length of the sound waves approaches the dimensions of the room that you're in, whole new problems crop up. Floyd Toole referred to this as the transition frequency of the room, meaning based on the size of the room, there's a frequency below which you have to approach solving the acoustic problems in a completely different way. Below that frequency, the room actually has more effect on your perception of bass than does the quality of the subwoofers you purchase. This is a dirty little secret in the world of high-performance audio, largely because it's just such a complicated problem to understand in the first place. But better subwoofers are still better, but your room is a huge part of what you wind up hearing, no matter what subs you buy. So more recently, we've spent years doing basic research, the sort of research you normally expect to see done at a university, on how to reproduce bass better in residentially sized rooms. And it grew out of some of the research that the company was created for in the first place. So I'm going to assume, this is just a quick little agenda to give you an idea of what's coming up. I'm going to assume that, like most people, you've done your best to forget any physics that you might have been taught in school. So please let me try to do my best Bill Nye the Science Guy imitation. I've tried to create a presentation that'll take things kind of one step at a time and be relatively easy to follow. I am a little bit concerned that people will get lost if we spin off onto too many tangents, because there's quite a lot to cover here that if you want to understand what we've been working on for a while. But please do ask questions along the way. I'll count on Shane to keep an eye on them, and I'll do my best to respond as we go along. I've tried to make this presentation sort of step by step, so it may be that I'll defer an answer to later in the presentation when I think it'll make more sense. But I very much enjoy talking to people about this kind of stuff, if you can't tell. So please do ask questions. And Shane, do you want to tell them the best way of asking questions?
Yeah, just drop any questions down in the comment section, fellas, guys.
Okay. So When more than one source is producing the same signal, you get constructive and destructive patterns. They're just inevitable. You might remember something like this from, Physics 101 in school. In some directions, the waves add up and they get bigger than when they started, and at other angles, they actually interfere with each other and cancel out. It's pretty easy to see in water, but the same thing happens with sound waves. And of course, I'm showing it in a two-dimensional simulation, but it's happening in all three dimensions. So, to keep things simple, the first simulations will assume that the side and the back walls are completely transparent, which is sort of like the ripples in the pond that you saw in the previous video, so that they can just kind of keep going. And that's not realistic, of course, but it's a little bit easier to see what's going on, a little bit less confusing. And of course, they're in 2 dimensions to keep it clear rather than 3. But for the moment, we'll stick with a room that is missing the walls, aside from the one behind the speaker. So the reflections don't overly complicate things. And, it is unrealistic, but it's easier to understand. So in the first example, you have a single subwoofer up against the wall at the bottom, radiating sound everywhere except where the wall behind it gets in the way. In the second case, you have the same basic idea, but now the sub is on the right wall and the other walls are gone. And then finally, when you combine those two simpler than real life examples, you get the third simulation where you can start to see the interference patterns. Sometimes it's stronger and brighter colors, and other times they cancel out and there's like no color at all. And the reason I'm showing you this is that the typical method for trying to even out the response in the room is to have multiple subs. And one way of thinking about it is that, if you put a sub in the room and sit someplace else, there are going to be certain frequencies based on those locations that are either very strong or very weak. And by having multiple subs, you can, hopefully have one sub be strong where another one might be weak, and kind of even things out, with the goal, of course, to have, reasonably uniform bass throughout the listening area. In reality, adding more subs just kind of moves the interference patterns around and makes them more complicated. And like, those are laws of physics that nobody can escape. But if you do use multiple subs and place them intelligently and use software like Multi-Sub Optimizer, it is possible to fill the room with enough reflected energy that the seat-to-seat variations can be minimized. The problem is that a great deal of low-frequency detail is also lost in the confusion because there's just so much going on. But notice that the 2-sub simulation that I'm starting again seems to be sending a lot of the energy on a diagonal, sort of toward the upper left. We'll come back to that idea in just a minute. So, when real walls are present and reflecting the sound back into the room, the reflections act like virtual subwoofers. They behave almost as though there's another sub behind the wall. It's like looking at a light bulb in a mirror. It's not the actual light bulb, but it sure looks and acts like one when you see it in the mirror. So even a single sub in a real room that has real walls gets confusing pretty quickly. The reflected sound interferes with the direct sound in much the same way that multiple subs interfere with each other. And it's a little bit like one of those funhouse mirrors at a carnival that just seems to go on forever. At specific frequencies, based on the dimensions of the room, these reflections create patterns of interference called standing waves, or room modes. Those terms are interchangeable the way we're using them here. That interference creates dramatic differences in what you can hear at low frequencies in the listening area, and even from one seat to the next seat. You can think of room modes as being like water waves sloshing around in a bathtub or in this lab. Before they eventually settle down, if the reflective wave matches up with the original wave or another reflection, the waves can get twice as big, or they can basically cancel each other out. When the wave fits the room perfectly, there are areas where it gets really, really big, and areas where it just pretty much disappears. You honestly can't hear it if it's a pure tone. And they appear to be standing still, hence the name. Instead of trying to repair the damage that's done by the effects of these wave interferences, we decided to study ways of minimizing the wave interference in the first place, and seeing if we could basically do away with standing waves to a very large degree. So let's see what we can do if we use DSP to control the timing of the sound waves across several subs. In the first case, we just have 2 subs. They're pretty close to each other. And based on the fact that they're pretty close to each other and the frequency that they're producing, it looks kind of like one maybe slightly bigger sub. But by the time you get to 3 subs, you begin to see a bit of a difference in the shape of the wave. It starts flattening out a little bit. And with 4 subs, the way they work together in this simulation is to change the shape of the wavefront so that it's really quite flat, and it travels down the room without a lot of reflections from the side walls. It's just moving in one direction, not all directions. So in principle, as you can see from the simulations, more subs placed intelligently yields better control. The number of subs depend on the size of the room and also the range of frequencies that you're interested in controlling. So we can get into some of those specifics later. But traditional base arrays, so having done that, a lot of people came away from the first webinar thinking that we're just reinventing the double base array, and that's on me. I didn't do a good enough job of explaining it. But a double base array has been around for a long time. That's not a new idea. There's a critical difference. In a traditional double base array, you have 2 groups of subwoofers, one in the front of the room that gets one signal, and they all get the same signal. And then there's another set of subs in the back of the room that gets the same signal, but it's inverted, so it's reversed polarity, and it's delayed by the amount of time it takes the sound to travel the length of the room. So it's designed to sort of catch or absorb the front wave and prevent it from just bouncing around forever in the room. In a traditional double base array or DBA, the front subs make all of the sound, and the rear subs are used only to absorb the sound from the front. And it's not even as good as you would like it to be. Oh, I should have pressed that button before this. Sorry about that. We'll let that run again. So in a traditional double base array, people who've tried implementing the idea have discovered that getting it to work is a lot more difficult than you would think at first blush. Asymmetries in the room mess things up, causing reflections that don't get absorbed at all. And therein lies the problem. In the real world, by the time the front wave reaches the rear wall, it's been broken up by risers and furniture and asymmetries in the room, like doors and windows and whatever. And the 3-dimensional sound field that started off maybe nice and clean in the front of the room, by the time it gets to the back of the room is very different. And so it doesn't get absorbed very well. And there's a lot more work to do if this is actually going to fulfill on what seems like a great idea, fulfill on the promise of it. So I should probably pause there. Are there any questions about just the wave interference stuff that I've been talking about? I know I went through it pretty fast.
No, you're good.
I'm good? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so people believe that bass is omnidirectional, much like dropping a pebble in a pond in this graphic. And most of the time it is. But it isn't because bass is fundamentally different than mid-range or high frequencies. It's because the drivers that reproduce bass are much, much smaller than the wavelengths they produce. So every 1-inch dome tweeter, doesn't matter whether it's concave, convex, or what the shape is. If it's a 1-inch tweeter, then it's going to start getting beamy at about 12 kilohertz. And the reason is that below that, at say 3 or 4 kilohertz, it's a lot smaller than the waves that it's producing. So it's literally not big enough to force them to go in a particular direction. They just go everywhere. But by the time you get up to about 12 kilohertz, the wavelength is roughly an inch. And so now it starts closing down. So it's less like a floodlight and more like a spotlight. And this is why, carefully towing in your speakers for the best stereo imaging and everything is really important, because no matter what you do to that 1-inch dome tweeter, by the time you get up into the top octave, it's going to be kind of beamy. The same thing happens for every frequency. But the difference is that you could have a really big, like an 18-inch subwoofer, and it's tiny compared to like an 80 hertz wave, which is about 14 feet long. So the sound is, it spreads in all directions, just like that pebble being dropped in a pond. We'll come back to this in a minute. So in our case, unlike the DBA example, each of our subs is driven independently, regardless of how many might be used. How we use the independence is based on measurement of the complex three-dimensional sound field of the room. And this gives us capabilities that traditional DBAs just can't achieve. So by introducing specific, precise timing differences, we can also aim the wave one way or another. We can also vary the shape of the wave that we're creating, making it more or less flat as needed, depending on what the room needs. And of course, this is all happening in 3 dimensions, even though the presentation is only in 2 dimensions. Using our 3-dimensional wavefield synthesis, we can steer and bend the wavefront to produce the sound in an optimal way based on the specifics or the idiosyncrasies of the room. And just as a side note, this idea of wavefield synthesis is similar to the original Trinnov research work that we were doing 20 years ago. But here's an important point that's very different than double base arrays. Base steering allows us to avoid a lot of problems in the first place, rather than having to try to fix them later down the road. Not only can we minimize reflections from sidewalls, floor, and ceiling, but we can even change the angle at which we're aiming that relatively flat wave to accommodate things like risers or even stadium seating in bigger theaters. So we can, rather than just blasting it out into the front of a bunch of risers, we can aim it so it's going up along the direction of the audience.
Question, John.
Mm-hmm.
Does a 12 hertz wave, just an example, change frequencies when it bounces off things?
No, the 12 hertz wave would be huge. I mean, that would be, I'd have to do the math, but that would be about 100 feet long off the top of my head, because it's 1130 feet per second for the speed of sound. So no, it doesn't change frequency, but it will bounce around quite a lot unless you're doing something to prevent it from bouncing around. We'll get to that soon. Anything else?
That's it.
Okay. So this is my little nerd alert here for the science geeks out there. If you've ever seen radio telescope farms, they have all of these ginormous dishes. And it's kind of the same thing that we're doing, except that rather than sending a signal, all of these dishes are working together to receive a signal from distant galaxies or whatever. And they work together to simulate one much, much larger dish. So if, for example, you aim them all in the same direction, but the radio wave is coming in from this direction, you have to time it so that when it hits this dish, and then what later hits a dish further along, and then later hits another dish further along, that they all can add up correctly and they can focus on what they're trying to see. And if you didn't understand that, don't worry about it. But it's important when if the waves you're trying to pick up are measured in kilometers rather than feet. So our idea is simple. While it's nice to be able to fix acoustic problems, it'd be even better to avoid them in the first place, right? So it's a lot easier to clean a room if it isn't a total mess. So let's start to look at some specific examples. Let's imagine that this is the front wall of your theater, and we have, in this case, multiple independent sources lined up, say, side by side. That'll give you some control based on the timing of whether it goes this way or that way. So you have some control over the side-to-side directionality, but you don't, and in the last case, because they're up and down, it gives you some vertical ability to steer the sound. But if they're all in a row like this, you only get part of the benefit. You still get some benefit, but you're not getting the whole package. So we can improve bass reproduction even in a more limited system like you see here by creating a suitable, directional wavefront. But the idea is to steer the wavefront away from the problematic areas in the room so that we can avoid making that mess of things in the first place. If you want to control both horizontal and vertical directions, you need to have some of both in your bass array. Now I sort of alluded to earlier, when the sound bounces off the walls, it comes back in, and it's the reflected energy. If you could see it, you're sitting at the other end of the room, if you could see that bounce off the side wall, it would look like there was a phantom speaker on the other side of the wall, just like, you see that light bulb in a mirror, right? It looks like it's further away, even though there's a wall there in the way, but the reflection looks quite realistic. So in the case of these subwoofers, the floors and sidewalls, floor, ceiling act like mirrors, and they bounce the sound back into the room, and they create these sort of virtual subwoofers. And it's that relatively large number of virtual sound sources that gives us so much control over the shape and directionality of the wavefront. In this case, you could control things to the left or right, but not up or down, since you can't control the vertical reflections independently. In this case, you can do a little bit of both. If you can control the original waves vertically and horizontally, then the mirror images also create reflections that will continue to work vertically and horizontally to reinforce what you're trying to do. With our new signal processing technology, we have a lot more flexibility than with a traditional double base array to deal with just real world issues, like the fact that you might not be able to put a subwoofer quite where you ideally might have wanted to put it. We can even manage different numbers of subs in the front of the room and the back of the room, and dealing with asymmetries like this, because we've done very careful measurements in a three-dimensional grid to find out what's actually happening in the room, so that we can understand how things are changing as the sound moves from the front to the back, and hopefully absorb the stuff that hits at the back of the room, despite the fact that it's been changed by the room along the way. It's a much more complex five-dimensional problem of frequency, time, and the three dimensions of space than normal signal processing has to deal with. And I know that was really geeky, but I should probably pause. Does any of that make sense? Did I lose too many people along the way?
Probably because nobody's got any questions, so it might be over some people's heads.
Okay, well,
so
it
those-
might be
so those
putting them to sleep.
So those base arrays, those little dots, those are
Yeah.
actual subwoofers, right?
Yeah, the idea is that
Yep.
is just indicative of where you're able to place the subs in some random system. There's nothing special about this arrangement. We just sort of plopped them on the wall to
So that's
convey the sense that we can work with things that aren't perfect.
all right. So the white part is the wall. The little black
Yep.
dots are the subs.
Yep.
So
And
we're
then the
hanging
little-
subwoofers. We're hanging
and the-
subwoofers, is what you're saying.
Yeah, the subwoofers ideally need to be up off the floor.
Yeah.
Because one of the reflections that you're hoping to get is the reflection off the floor. And if it's right on the floor, it doesn't actually go down and then bounce up again. It's like it only can go up because the floor gets in the way.
Gotcha.
So yeah, this is not something that is going to be like a weekend project to experiment with. This requires a little bit of planning and work.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about how we can steer the wave. And I mentioned that we can do that to avoid sort of problematic parts of the room, like the risers. We can move the sound up at the angle of the risers. We can use that same ability to effectively absorb the sound waves that we've created. So using the analysis and signal processing, we can change both the shape and the direction of the waves that we're creating so as to catch or absorb the incoming wave, which may be more different than you would like it to be from when it left the front wall and now it's reached the back wall after having bumped into a bunch of stuff. So controlling that shape and the direction is important. Without that capability, the curvature of the wavefront when it reaches the other side of the room is, well, let me not even go there yet. I'll continue on. So the reason we've discussed these relatively flat waves in a lot of detail is there's several reasons. To the degree that we can create a relatively flat wavefront, we can greatly minimize the reflections from the sidewalls, floor, and ceiling. So right off the bat, it's just a cleaner reproduction of whatever's in the recording. You hear it, it goes past you, and then gets absorbed at the back wall. Even if there's somewhat less control over the shape of the wavefront than we would like, because there are not as many subs as that great big room needs, the wave arriving at the back of the room is still flatter and easier to deal with than when it would have left just a couple of subs in the corners, because you're working with something that's a little bit more specific. And it's as though the group of subwoofers begin to behave like a single, much larger subwoofer, at least up to a certain frequency that's determined by the array of subs that you're using. So We don't want subs bouncing around, excuse me, we don't want sound at low frequencies bouncing around in the room in a totally uncontrolled manner. We need to keep the wavefront clean and simple for better performance and better clarity at those frequencies. And also so that it can be absorbed effectively once you've heard it and you don't need it bouncing around anymore. It
Question
turns
here.
out, yeah,
Do all the subwoofers have to be the same for this to work? Can they be different?
we haven't done a lot of research on that, but just intuitively, yeah, I think they really should be the same.
Yeah.
Because different subs with different drivers, or even the same driver in different enclosures, dynamically they're going to behave a little bit differently. And I don't know that we know yet the degree to which we can also compensate for those differences. There's a lot of stuff going on as it is, even if you have all identical subs. It may well be that I'm being overly pessimistic, but the truth is I don't think we know yet. We've done this in a small number of rooms where we've been able to do a lot of very detailed research, and starting at ISE in Barcelona a few weeks ago, we opened it up to some of our business partners and their showrooms, for example, dealers and distributors around the world who want to renovate the showroom and show what's possible. And we're planning to work very closely with those folks to take full advantage of what's possible. And in the process, we'll be gathering more data to make sure that if the algorithm needs to be tweaked just a little bit here or there, that we can do that before we put it out into the larger world.
Mm-hmm.
So this slide is a little bit of a brain tease, but I mentioned that we don't want the sound bouncing around in an uncontrolled manner, and we want to hear everything nice and clean, but that means that you also have to absorb it once you've heard it. And it turns out that the same sort of phased array that creates a simpler wavefront can also be used to absorb energy, just like those radio telescopes. And it can do so from a wide range of angles, just like the radio telescopes. This is key to catching and absorbing the spurious reflections that maybe didn't start at the front wall, but were caused by risers or furniture or asymmetries in the room. So I'll walk through this, and I'll try to do it fairly slowly. Let's visualize a wave that's hitting the wall from an angle. The red line in this case is the red dotted line is the leading edge of the wave, and the pink arrow shows the direction it's moving. So it's coming from the upper right, traveling diagonally toward the wall. And as you would expect, it will then bounce off the wall just like a mirror and start moving, from bottom right to upper left. And the wavefront, is at 90 degrees also in this case. So it bounces off at the same angle as it arrives. We can, as I already showed you, we can create waves that leave the wall at an angle. So imagine now that we know that this wave is coming in, and at just the right time, we create an equal but opposite wave going in the direction that the first wave will bounce off the wall and be going in. And the result is we can cancel the original wave as it hits the wall with the subwoofers, so that reflection never happens in the first place. So this is a critical piece of the puzzle. So if there are any questions about this, we probably should go through it again now. Give everybody a chance to type.
I don't know if there's anything on that specific question there.
Okay.
But there are other questions we'll come back to.
Okay. Well, so if you have a bunch of subs in these two phased arrays, we can create a planar wave that goes down the length of the room, and that minimizes the sidewall, floor, and ceiling reflections by a lot. So that right off the bat, that simplifies the room's influence on the sound. This is a model of the room that we had at ISE in Barcelona when we were introducing the idea to our business partners. Notice that all of the subs in this case, unlike a DBA, as the sound comes off the front wall and travels the length of the room, we're not showing reflections to keep it simple, then we can absorb most of the sound when it hits the back wall. Realistically, you're not going to get all of it, but let's say you can get 90% of it. Then we can also use those subs in the front wall to catch what's left over, right? So 90% of it gets caught and dissipated, and then whatever small amount might be left over, we can absorb. Because unlike a normal DBA, all of our subs can be emitters and absorbers as needed. Again, that's crazy complication, but
Right.
it's it's why this is so important.
So is the rear wall firing out of phase? Is that how it's
Yeah,
canceling? Okay.
yeah, yeah. It's and out of phase and delayed. So in that regard, it's
Yeah.
similar to the idea of a double base array. It just works a lot better because we can accommodate all the imperfections that the real world introduces. So the good news is you don't have to have a gazillion subwoofers, in the front and the back walls. You do have to have some, but with the new technology, we've gotten really excellent results with only 3 subs in a little bit of a triangle in the front wall and the back wall. And it is somewhat less effective than having a whole bunch of subs, but you get a lot of benefit. And the diminishing returns, it works quite well early on, and then, continues to get a little bit better and better, depending on how crazy you want to be. But the principle is that you have multiple subwoofers used to produce a nice clean wavefront that propagates through the room with as few reflections as we can manage based on being able to aim it or steer it. And then all of the subwoofers, including the ones that made the sound in the first place, can be used to absorb any energy that would otherwise bounce around in the room for quite a while. So to
Here's a
produce
good,
the clean, yeah,
here's,
go
here's a
ahead.
good one. If I had, let's say, an 80-inch sub at the back of the room, how do you control and contain that? Would you need 2?
How big a sub?
80-inch.
Okay, so like the Ascendo 80
Yeah.
and shit. Well, that's actually a sub that's big enough compared to the size of the room that it would create a bit of a planar wave all by itself. What it wouldn't allow us to do is to send it one direction or the other, because you need the independent control to be able to do that. But I know I haven't heard that system yet, but you did, Shane.
Yeah.
I suspect one of the reasons why, if you thought that the bass was, unusually clean and dynamic and everything,
Yeah.
is that you are getting some of the same sort of planar performance,
Right.
in that, it's a much cleaner wavefront than something that's, you got a sub in the corner and the wave starts out small and then gets bigger and bigger and bigger. This is kind of a flat wave to begin with because the thing is so big. It's sort of like the 1-inch dome tweeter, but at 12 kilohertz, right?
Right. Because it's
So
taking up so much, I guess,
such a big part of the
surface.
wall.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, to reiterate, to get the clean wavefront in the first place, we use the bass steering, as I've talked about. Having more subs provides better wave forming and steering, and therefore also more complete absorption because we have better control over that side of it. In this example, with just a 3x3 array, it still works quite well. Not as well as, a bigger array, but it still is remarkably. Bleh, I need some water. So it's remarkably effective. So the technology requires a minimum of 2 subwoofers each on the front wall and the back wall. That will only give you control in either horizontal or vertical, depending on how they're arranged. If you have 3 in like a little triangle, then we can do a little bit of both, and it works better. And then our signal processing matches the amount of bass steering that we have available to us based on the way the room is built, to the acoustic characteristics of the room to do as much as can be done with that set of hardware. So, traditional MSO style subwoofer arrangements, to get back to the world that most of us hobbyists have been living in for a long time, they optimize for minimizing seat-to-seat variations so that you and the person you're sitting next to have as similar an experience as possible, a shared experience. And they do that by flooding the zone with so many densely overlapping standing waves that the result averages out to about the same amount of energy everywhere, or at least within the listening area. By contrast, we're optimizing for something else entirely. Our aim is to define clear, well-defined, a clean, well-defined wavefront that reveals what's in the recording and then is actively absorbed to avoid the reflections that MSO style approaches depend on in order to work. And in so doing, we're minimizing the cacophony of reflections that wind up obscuring detail and dynamics, while also minimizing the standing wave problems that create the seat-to-seat variations in the first place. So we're really turning everything on its head. In order to do that, we have to have a very clear understanding of what's happening in the room's three-dimensional sound field, complete with all of the challenges and imperfections you get in the real world. And then we use a combination of base steering and active absorption to, first of all, avoid problems in the first place to the degree that it's possible. And then secondly, to take advantage of any beneficial characteristics in the room's acoustics, which I'll get to in just a moment. And then thirdly, actively absorbing bass once it's passed through the listening area just that first time, so that you can hear all the clarity, all the detail that's in the recording without having your room superimposed on top of everything. We refer to this as the reshaping of the room. It's almost, the walls of your room create all of the reflections that so drastically change the sound at these low frequencies. And this is like, what if we could effectively eliminate the effects of the walls in the room, so you could hear just what's in the recording instead of what's in the recording then muffled by all the junk that's happening in your room bouncing around. Of course, eliminating the walls without a wrecking ball is, difficult. So we can take a somewhat closer look at what's going on. And this is where we're taking advantage of something that there might be a beneficial trait of the room. So let's say you have a media room, and on one side, in this diagram it's to the right, on one side it's open to the dining room and the kitchen and the rest of the first floor. So in the first diagram, a single sub will still have strong reflections from the left side wall that will create some seat-to-seat variations and some problems. If you had a more traditional double bass array kind of arrangement in the front of the room, it would generate fewer reflections from that sidewall, since more of the energy is going down the length of the room and less of it's being sprayed everywhere. In our room-optimized bass array, we go another step further. So in a case like this, for example, we can steer more of the energy off to the right, away from the reflective wall, and toward the open area where the energy can just dissipate out, in the kitchen or wherever. And then we still are absorbing whatever is left over after that's done. So the red arrows are strong reflections, the blue ones are, gentler reflections. Yeah.
So obviously, so we're talking about front subs in the front and rear. Would this make sense to have anything on the sides?
Not really, because the way this works is you're trying to simplify the wave, the way the sound propagates down the room. And so if you have sound coming from all directions, now you're back to, I suppose it might be possible. I haven't really thought about that, but it would be tricky. It would be even more complex than what we're already doing. A big part of what we're doing is, again, trying to avoid the problem in the first place by eliminating the sidewall, floor, and ceiling reflections to the greatest possible degree. So if you can just have it go down the length of the room, and if you can then catch it and prevent it from bouncing back and forth, you get a clearer idea of what's actually in the recording.
Right.
So, just to sum up, why is this not a double bass array? Like, it has been done mostly in Germany for some reason. But Germany it's like an entire country full of engineers. It's just different there.
Yeah.
So both things, double bass array and what we're doing now, share the idea that you have subs at the front wall and at the back wall. And they share the idea that, once you've heard something, you're trying to get rid of it. But there's a big difference. With a traditional double bass array, you have one output that is shared among all of the subwoofers in the front, and another is designed to absorb the sound once it reaches the rear. But it's just those two signals, one in the front, and then it's inverse in the back that's delayed by the amount of time it takes the sound to travel the room. They can't do any of the intelligent steering of the sound that you might need to do as soon as the room is kind of in the real world instead of, an idealized laboratory experiment. Another limitation of the double base array is that they're using half of the subwoofers that you paid good money for solely for making the sound, and the other half solely for trying to absorb it, while we can use all of the subs to do everything. They also depend completely on a very rigid and specific geometric arrangement of the subs in order to work at all. And that geometric arrangement is quite inflexible if you want it to work properly. We can use our understanding of the three-dimensional sound fields in the room and our measurements of exactly where these things are and how they're interacting with the room to make the best use of whatever you can give us. I mean, the rules of physics still apply, of course, but so there are some requirements for getting the very best results. A strict double base array configuration would be great, but the main thing here is that thanks to our signal processing, we can actually rely more on sort of the density of subs than on the precise geometric arrangement of the subs. And it gives us flexibility to deal with the fact that, if you needed to have a sub dead center in your room, dead center in the middle of the screen, well, guess what? You have a center channel speaker there. You probably can't manage that. So it's going to have to be to one side or the other, right? And double base arrays don't work that way, but we can work that way.
Right.
And then even if you did design a room to, do the traditional double base array thing, that wavefront is easily broken up by, again, the furniture, the risers, architectural features like maybe a coffered ceiling, so that the wave that reaches the back of the room doesn't look at all like the one that left the front of the room. So how do you absorb it with just a simple inverted version of what left the front of the room? It's not going to work very well. And if you have a very plain shoebox of a room with no risers and very sparse furnishings, then the double base array can work. It's not BS. It's not tolerant of imperfections. By comparison, we can kind of work with whatever you give us.
Does it have to be a symmetrical orientation? Like if you have three, well, like say three up front. Say you have one in the upper left corner, one in the upper right, single one on the bottom. Can you have just two in the back, or does it have to be the same?
No, we can work with different numbers of subs front and back. One thing that is different is that this, and this is true of the double base array as well. Remember I talked about how a 1-inch dome tweeter is beamy above about 12K?
Mm-hmm.
In a similar way, the distance between these sources of sound determines the upper limit or the shortest waves that they can have effective control over. So you don't typically want you wouldn't want the subs to be at the extreme corners of the front wall. You'd want to bring them in from the front wall so that they're closer to each other and they can control things better.
Right.
And also so that the reflections also are spaced a little bit more uniformly. It's less critical than a double base array, but we are using the reflections off the floor, the sidewall, and the ceiling to enable that wave to be more controlled than it would be otherwise.
Right. Okay. So it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be like I got three subs up front, 4 subs in the back. They'll still work together. It doesn't have to be the same amount.
Again, we'll work with what you can give us.
Okay.
But for any number of subs, and this is the part that a lot of people are just not going to be able to deal with it easily. For any number of subs, they're going to work better if they're not at the extremes of the wall, but inset a little bit from the wall. So they're a little bit closer to each other, because that gives us the ability to steer it one way or the other. Whereas if it's all the way out here, we can still steer really long waves, lower frequencies, but the point at which the steering becomes ineffective comes down as the subwoofers get further away from each other.
But subs will have to be off the ground.
Ideally. I mean, we'll work with what you give us, but for the best results, you'd want to get them off the ground, because if you think about it, let's say go back to the light bulb idea. If there's 2 light bulbs at, say, 1/4 and 3/4 of the width of the front wall, and if the side walls are all mirrors and the back wall is all mirrors, you would see a whole string of light bulbs that were equally spaced. You've got, half the width of the wall between them, and then 1/4 and 1/4. But then in the mirror image, you have another 1/4 and 1/4 because of the mirror before you see the phantom light bulbs. And then that just keeps going on out. So you want the reflections to be, somewhat evenly spaced so that they're helping you do what you're trying to do.
Right, right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And what would be more influential, size or number of subwoofers?
Probably number. Size will, of course, have an effect on how deep the subs can go and how loud they can play. There's no replacement for excursion when you're trying to, you know, have a really impactful bass.
Right.
But if I had to choose between a larger number of good quality 12-inch woofers or just one or two 18-inch woofers, I would. We can get more done with a larger number of smaller woofers.
So I guess back to the other original question was, can you mix match subs? I guess it wouldn't make sense if you had a front wall with four 18-inchers and maybe a back wall full of four 8-inchers or four 10-inchers.
Again, we'll work with what you give us, but the dynamics, the way that the front wall subs respond to a signal and the way that the back wall subs respond to the same signal are probably going to be different unless they're the same subs. So I don't have enough experience with this yet myself to know how difficult it will be for us to account for that on top of everything else. But that's one of the things we're hoping to learn by working with our partners in showrooms around the world.
Right, right, right. Okay. Would that also work with near field subs?
I don't think so, because near field subs typically are not up against a wall.
Yeah.
So, they're radiating a spherical wave because they're out in the middle of the room. They're on either end of your couch or,
Yeah.
whatever. So, yeah, no, I don't think that the near field sub thing is going to work in this context. It has other benefits, don't get me wrong. There's more than one way to try to skin this cat. But the main benefit of near field subs is that you're hearing more of the direct sound from the sub and somewhat less of the reflected energy bouncing around in the room, which is it's a different approach, but it's fundamentally similar to what we're trying to do, to the degree that you can raise the direct to reflected sound ratio. Things will sound cleaner and more detailed, more dynamic.
And how much processing overhead does this physics magic add?
Well, there's a measurement process to first get the data, and we've been using a 1 meter three-dimensional array, like microphone, move it a meter to the right, move it a meter to the left, move it a meter up, move it a meter down. So we're doing a big three-dimensional tic-tac-toe board of microphone placements, so we can really understand what's happening in the room in the real world as opposed to just based on theory. It goes fairly quickly. Each one of those test signals is only a couple of seconds, and then we move it to the next one. So you can do a room in 20 or 30 minutes pretty easily. But it is an additional step. And then the number crunching, this was where, as I understand it, because I've been somewhat involved with this, not doing the actual work because I'm not that smart, but providing feedback on what we needed, prioritizing different things, stuff like that. There was a lot of work done optimizing the algorithms because in the early part of this research process, it was just a brute force method, and like you would get all these measurements and then you'd throw a high-powered computer at it, and you'd go away and come back and get the results in like a week or 10 days, which
Right, wow.
is just not a product that we can sell. By optimizing the algorithm, and a lot of that was figuring out, if you try to make it perfect, you not only are going to spend a lot more time trying to do the math, but you're also trying to accomplish something that people can't hear necessarily. So a lot of the research was like, okay, so how do we prioritize the degree to which it has to be done right in order for this whole thing to work? And what aspects of the calculations can we safely ignore because you can't hear the result anyway? So, but through optimizing the algorithm, the development of the algorithm, we're able to take it from literally many days of computations to a few minutes, like
Right.
maybe 20 minutes. It's not going to, it's the sort of thing where you'll probably want to go get a cup of coffee, but it's manageable.
Okay. All right.
So, just by way of summing up, the idea of having independently driven multiple sources of sound and then multiple controllers or absorbers of sound in the room, all driven by this signal processing, gives us the power to really reshape the acoustics of the room in entirely new ways. Because where traditional subwoofer management is trying to mitigate bass problems or to sort of cover them up, we're trying to get rid of most of the problems to prevent them from happening in the first place. And then we are actively absorbing whatever remains once you've had a chance to hear it. And there's a lot on this slide, but you can take it for a moment or two. While you're reading that, if there are any integrators on the call, you'll be happy to know that this will all run on job sites that do not have internet access yet, like new construction sites and things like that, because of the optimization of the algorithm and the computational power that we've got in the altitude. Between those two things, everything's being done in the altitude. You don't have to like put it out in the cloud and wait for the results to come back. So all this sounds great in theory, but what are the real world results? Early on, that three-dimensional matrix of microphone positions I was telling you about, we were actually doing 96 measurements in a single room because we wanted to make sure that we weren't just kind of moving the problem away from where we happened to put the microphones to just a different location, but that we're actually fixing the problem and fixing the entire acoustic field. So you're about to see before and after graphs from a real room, one of the ones that we did a lot of research in, and it's focusing in on just the range from 20 hertz to 100 hertz. You can see the difference with and without the acoustic field control. Each of the lines in this graph represents the response at different locations in the room. The red line is our main listening position, or like the money seat. The blue and the yellow lines represent the statistical standard deviation of all the microphone positions, if there are any math guys out there. In the before curves, the subs are used conventionally, just the way MSO or something like that would do. And there are still 10 decibel swings on what different people experience depending on where they are in the room. This, when it's plus 10 dB here and minus 10 dB there, subjectively that means that some people are hearing 4 times as much bass as other people are hearing. It's not a subtle difference at all, at any given frequency. In the after curves, those deviations are reduced to about plus or minus 2 dB, which most people won't even be able to notice, even if they're sort of paying attention. I'm also involved with RP22, the recommended practices. It's not really a standards committee, but that's how it usually gets described. But CEDIA and CTA are working on this recommended best practices for all kinds of things. And the RP22 recommendations for high performance audio in home theaters and things like that specifies that we're aiming for a plus or minus 2 decibel window measured in at least the main listening position and one adjacent chair. So, you and your best friend. And the rest of the room, is going to be kind of what it is. But if you want the highest level 4 performance, you have a plus or minus 2 decibel window for these 2 chairs. Using this technology, we can achieve that level of performance for every seat in the room.
Wow. And is this an additional license, or is it part of the Altitude's features, base features?
It will be just part of our base features. We have no plans to, one of the great things about the Altitude is that it's a software-based platform, rather than depending on a lot of third-party chips from Analog Devices or Texas Instruments or whomever. We're doing all this software and running it on a PC, Linux-based PC in the box that does all of the signal processing. So we have more control over it. We have more computational horsepower than you get in a DSP chip, and just a lot more flexibility. But we have a history of providing free software updates because we're always developing new technology to stay competitive and ahead of the curve and all of that. And so if we're doing that, why wouldn't we make it available to all the people who already own our products that helped us get to where we are now?
Right.
Or at least that's the way I think of it.
One of the main things of Trinnov, every time there's an update, there's no extra $300, $400, $500 price tag.
Or quite a bit more in some cases.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have to replace the entire decoder board
Yep.
well, most products won't even let you do that, right? It's,
Yeah.
you basically turf out the old surround processor and buy in a new one, which after a while really adds up. And the handful of companies that have been really good and have provided ways for their customers to kind of upgrade along the way, those decoder boards and those DSP chips and everything cost a lot of money. We're talking thousands of dollars, not hundreds usually.
Mm-hmm.
So another way to visualize what is actually happening in the room is with something called wavelet analysis. And most of you have probably never seen graphs like these, so I'll explain. These graphs are designed to show three different things in a two-dimensional graph. So the vertical scale here is from 10 hertz up to 400 hertz. Time runs from left to right. Color shows how loud the sound is at any combination of frequency and time, with red being loud and blue being quiet, according to the little rainbow scale you can see off on the right side. Point A, the first graph, just realized that you can't see point A, B, and C, but okay, the first one is the main listening position in this particular room, and the other two are just taken randomly within the listening area. And you can see that if you think about what I just described, you can sort of see the low frequencies just bouncing back and forth in the room, especially from about 70 hertz on down. The vertical sort of colored stripes represent ranges of frequencies that just take a long time to settle down or to decay. If you look really closely, it's a little hard to see, but you should be able to see a little dotted line that we drew to show kind of the envelope of the colored area, which defines the decay time, or the amount of time it takes any given frequency to fade away once it gets going. As with almost any room, the bass takes a lot longer to fade away than the mids and the highs, just because it's so much harder to absorb. You can see the little envelope dotted line a little bit more easily here. With our multi-source, multi-controller technology, reduces the decay time dramatically and everywhere, not just in the main listening position. And the result is, you can see this, the time it takes for the bass that's down below 70 hertz in this case, is reduced from bouncing around in the room for almost half a second, 350 to 400 milliseconds, and it's reduced down to about 1/10 of a second. Subjectively, that eliminates a lot of the chaos in the room and reveals a lot of detail from your subs that you probably didn't even know was there. You've never heard it before. But what about integrating the bass with all the mid-range and treble stuff? How's that going to work? Great concert halls tend to be highly reverberant. I used to live in Boston. My wife and I went to Symphony Hall dozens of times each year. Typically, this was before we had children, but it was great. It was a lot of fun back then. So a really good concert hall is defined by the fact that it has this rich, lush sound that frequencies. So it just gives you that enveloping sound that's so much fun to listen to. At the other end of the spectrum, you have recording studios, which are usually very heavily treated, and they're quite lean or dry with a lot less reverberation, because the mixing engineer wants to hear even the smallest details in the recording that he's mixing and mastering. And you can't do that when there's a lot of stuff bouncing around in the room. The precision of the sound in the recording studio makes the job of mixing and mastering just so much easier. And so it turns out you can have either like so-called wet or reverberant room, or a very dry and damped room, and they both can sound very balanced and pleasant. The wet room will seem probably more rich, while the dry room seems more precise and detailed, but either can sound really good and be quite satisfying. The problem comes when the sound bouncing around in the room has more energy in some ranges than others. So on the one on the right-hand side here, you can see there are some frequencies where the sound drops out really fast, and then there are other frequencies where it kind of lingers in the room for a while. And that calls attention to the long decays and can actually obscure information that might have been in the shorter decays. Unfortunately, most residential rooms for music, movies, or just having a conversation are more like the third example than either of the first two. And this is, by the way, if you one of the rookie mistakes when treating a room is to just put damping everywhere, and it winds up sounding horrible because you can very easily damp the mids and the highs and make them very dry, but the bass is much harder to control and absorb. So the imbalance is what sounds unpleasant. So here's a room that is not nearly as well behaved in the real world. It does have some light treatment with passive, like 1-inch thick fiberglass panels that are, attached to the wall, and they provide some benefit in the mids and the highs, but not so much in the lower mid range or the bass. The details are different than one of the other rooms we were looking at, but results like this are pretty typical. And some of the lowest frequencies here are lingering in the room for almost half a second. After applying this new technology and better passive treatment, suddenly the decay time of the bass can be dialed in so that it matches the amount of decay time in the mid-range that's just above it. And the decay time in the room can now be quite uniform across the spectrum, whether you want it to be a little bit more rich or a little bit more precise. And the improvement is not subtle at all. Also, the sweet spot is much bigger because you're eliminating all those standing waves that caused the problem in the first place. So the really important point, we're not claiming that this new technology replaces the need for passive acoustic treatment or sensible technical design of your room in the first place. In fact, in some ways, the opposite is true. Active acoustics, like what we do with the optimizer and what we are doing now with this new technology, tends to work in precisely the areas where passive treatment doesn't work so well. And conversely, passive treatment tends to address the things that we have no way of treating. So for example, if you have nothing but hard surfaces in the room, the sound is going to be bouncing around for a very long time at all frequencies, and there's nothing that any room correction system can do about that. If the RT60 is really long, it's going to sound like a high school gymnasium. And we'll give you a good sounding high school gym, but it'll still sound like a high school gym. But conversely, with the kind of acoustic treatment that's maybe 1 inch or 2 inches or even 4 inches thick, that stuff just doesn't work very well for bass because the waves are not measured in inches, they're measured in feet or meters. And it's just not enough to be effective. So ideally, the person who's designing the room would know a little bit about room acoustics and also a little bit about what's possible with what we call active acoustics, and use those two things together to elevate the entire playing field. If you don't pay attention to the passive acoustics of the room, you're likely to have a gap between where the passive treatment ceases to be effective and the highest frequency where we can help the most. So, for example, in this room, it just has the 1-inch thick fiberglass absorbers bolted to the wall, and they are ineffective from about 200 hertz on down. We're now showing, by the way, take a close look at the slide. We're now showing from 20 hertz all the way up to 1,000 hertz. We had been looking from 20 to 400 earlier. In this case, there's a gap between where the active acoustics and the passive acoustics work well. Rather than meeting nicely in the middle, there's a range in the middle from about 80 to 200 hertz that is inadequately damped in this room. So that energy from 80 to 200 is going to be lingering in the room longer than the rest of the energy does, and therefore it's going to make the room sound colored and far from neutral. The mid bass in that 80 to 200 range is going to sound pretty bloated and uncontrolled, and it has nothing to do with the speakers. This is the room doing bad things to otherwise good speakers. And this is specifically the reason why we think a really well-designed room for like state-of-the-performance audio really needs a combination of both active and passive acoustics as well as informed design in the first place. But for the first time, there's a practical way of creating uniform decay time across the entire spectrum by using a combination of active acoustics and passive treatments. So, quick review. We've covered a lot of ground. Knowing that most people have forgotten any physics that they might have had in school, and they worked hard to do that in some cases, we talked a little bit about how wave interference of reflections is the thing that causes standing waves, these room modes that you've been hearing about, which, make different people have very different experiences. We also looked into how that same sort of interference might be used constructively in order to sort of simplify that cacophony of bass that otherwise is bouncing around in the room. By creating directional waves, not necessarily planar, but things that we have at least some control over, we can minimize the uncontrolled reflections that are so difficult to absorb or even manage. We can steer the bass where it's going to work well and away from places that's going to cause problems. And that same steering mechanism, flipped on its head, also allows us to do a better job of canceling the sound out once you've heard it and it now reaches the wall behind you. Active absorption can clean up the mess in the room, so you hear low frequency details that you probably didn't even know were there. And by having this kind of sophisticated control over multiple independent sources of sound and multiple independent controllers of sound, we have powerful tools to reshape the behavior of your room at low frequencies. And then finally, we looked at the real world results taken in a few different rooms that we used during the development process. And the results are pretty striking and we feel game changing. We've had to be kind of quiet about this because we've been working on it a long time, and we wanted to protect it until, we had actually filed the various patent applications. But shortly after we did the last of the patent applications, we had that trade show in Barcelona. We did some demos. And then very shortly after my last presentation of some of this material, this was an unsolicited reaction that I received from one of our dealers who's unusually well-versed in both acoustics in general and specifically the problems of dealing with low-frequency acoustics. I'll let you read it. I hate it when people read slides to you. But we've also received a great deal of interest from various speaker manufacturers, as you might imagine. Many of whom have struggled with these same issues for years, and you can imagine how they might feel about the prospect of people actually hearing how good their products are, rather than having to live with the room itself dominating the sound at low frequencies instead of the great subwoofers that they bought, for example. This is frankly just the beginning of a very long rollout of advanced active acoustics that is going to be based on this research that we've been doing for the last few years. This is just the kind of stuff that we'll be introducing in the next year, maybe 18 months. There are some follow-on things that I don't even know about yet, but I know that they exist. So with that, if everybody's had a chance to read this, are there any questions?
Just one. How can DSP correct these reflections? I think he meant that gap that you showed earlier.
So just it goes back to that slide that had the three examples. You had the sound coming into the wall and then bouncing and going in that direction. But we can also create a wavefront that goes in, kind of any direction we want it to go in. So we time the opposite, the inverted polarity version of what's coming in. We create an opposite and equal version that's heading out at exactly the time that reflection would be heading out. And so what comes in and gets reflected cancels with what we are creating, and we can basically eliminate the reflection. And it's not perfect, but it's huge. It's like 90% or more. And then what little energy is left in the room that still maybe is bouncing around, we can then cancel out with subsequent DSP, the same sort of process, but at a smaller level because they're smaller amounts of sound.
What frequency range does this correction just for the subs operate in? From 20 hertz to like what?
It depends on how closely the subs are spaced. So that's just the speed of sound divided by I have a little spreadsheet that I use for figuring this stuff out because I don't trust my arithmetic. But if you want to control it to a higher frequency,
Right.
the subs need to be more densely packed, right? They need to be closer to each other. If they're spread out, then we can only do steering to up to a longer frequency based on the space between the subs. And just to give you one example, so like 1130 feet per second. What we're trying to do is just keep the woofers within a half wave of each other. So 1130 feet per second divided by 2, because you're talking about a half wave, divided by 5 feet, if you're 5 feet apart, that works out to 113 hertz, if I remember my calculator work earlier today. So it's the speed of sound divided by 2 for the half wave, and then divided again by the spacing between the sources, and that'll give you the upper frequency at which, beyond which it becomes less effective in a hurry. So yeah, we've got 2 subs 5 feet apart. We can get all the way up to about 113 hertz, which is not shabby.
Yeah.
Now, if you only have the 2, all we can control is horizontal directivity and no vertical. So ideally, you might have 3 that are in a big equilateral triangle, or 4 or whatever. But if you give us more subs and greater density of subs, we could do more. But that part of it is driven completely by physics. It's not magic. It's just the way waves work.
And are there any recommended subs by Trinnov, at least for off-the-ground subs? Will in-wall subwoofers work?
Yeah, in-wall subs will work great. And you still have to be, pay attention to kind of where you put them. But in-wall subs are actually kind of ideal. Either in-wall or at least fairly shallow subs would be better than subs that are, way out in the middle of the room.
Right. What is this? I just tuned in, so this will be a new bass control feature for altitude. When will it be available?
Kind of depend. I mean, we are working with some of our various business partners, including some high-end acoustic engineering companies that are very excited about this, and calling me every day to find out when they can get involved. I think that part of the process of continuing to fine-tune things just a little bit based on real-world experience in a larger number of rooms, that's probably going to take us the rest of this year, because we don't want to ship something that's half-baked. It needs to be really, really solid if we're going to be asking our customers to spend more money on subwoofers. So we're going to be refining it over the course of this year. We will certainly do a fair number of sort of practice installations that our R&D team will be directly involved in. I hope to get a few case studies out of that in addition to the data from, for the R&D guys. I would expect that we'd probably be releasing the first iteration of this to the public at large early next year.
Right. Still some time to wait, guys.
Yeah, a little bit. We may have announced this a little bit early, but we've been working on it for so damn long. And as soon as we had the patents filed, so we had at least some measure of protection, we wanted to get at least our distributors and dealers involved with it so we could accelerate the R&D, the last half of the R&D process.
Yeah, man, can't wait. Okay, thanks for the question, guys. This is Q&A portion. Okay. What else here? Casper, blah, blah, blah. Do we have something else? I feel like there was something else. Here's one. He's got a 4.5 by 6.5 meter height by 3 meter and starting to build 6 to 10 inch, 18 inch sealed subs. How should I think here? Front stacks with 3 by 18 inch will be 2.2 meter high. Is that enough height?
I'm not sure I followed all of that.
Yeah, it was a little tough one.
Tell you what, careful what I wish for here. If you have something like that where you're actually beginning to design a room and you're interested in providing for the possibility of doing something like this, my email address is on the website. It's Jon, Jon, it's short for Jonathan, so no H, Jon.Herron Herron, Herron, so like the bird, but 2 R's, at Trinnov.com. Jon.Herron at Trinnov.com. Give me the dimensions of the room and what you're thinking you might do. I can put it into my little spreadsheet calculator and tell you that, based on what you describe, it'll do this. And if you add, another sub or another 2 subs, it'll do that kind of thing. Because that part of it is, it's basically double bass array theory. We can do better than double bass array theory to a degree, meaning we can handle these kind of irregularly spaced things that double bass arrays can't do. But at a base level, it is really the distance between the subs that matters most. So if I can get that kind of information from you, if you have a wall that, let's say front wall is, 17 feet wide, and it's a 9-foot ceiling, and you're thinking putting, 4 subs in the wall, where should I put them, or 6 subs, or whatever you decide you want to do. If you give me that kind of rule of thumb of what you're thinking about, I can give you a better idea of the range of frequencies that it'll be very effective at.
Okay. Do the subs need to be completely free from the seats? EXT.
I'm not sure I follow.
Yeah. No way, man. You might have to elaborate on that question a little bit more.
Free from the seats. I mean, what we're talking about is subs that are either in the walls or attached to the walls, front and back of the room. If they're talking about actuators like butt kickers and things like that, it's a whole different thing. It doesn't really have anything to do with this.
Is the HDMI 2.1 upgrade coming out soon?
I wish I knew. We have yet to be able to get production quantities of the chips that we really want to use. The HDMI 2.1 chips that are generally available right now can handle a total of 4 inputs and only 1 output. We've always tried to design for 8 inputs and 2 outputs, so you could have maybe a projection TV for movie night or the Super Bowl, and then a direct view TV for watching the news or whatever. And the chips, for whatever reason, the chips that are 8x2 instead of 4x1 are just not available. I mean, we have handfuls of them for prototyping purposes, but we need a few thousand of them to start building these boards, because everybody's going to want them when they're available. And we just have not been able to source those quantities of those chips, which is painful. But it's beyond our control, because it's up to the people who make the chips.
I mean, aside from video gamers, are you really missing out on anything? Not having that.
Okay, so this is just my personal opinion. It has nothing to do with Trinnov, but I really don't think so. Yeah. I get the whole super high frame rate and super low latency stuff for gamers, because if you're a competitive gamer and you're playing a shoot 'em up kind of game, then every few milliseconds that you can squeeze out of it gives you an edge. I get that. I'm not one of those gamers, but I understand the idea. For people like me who are mostly interested in music and movies, I just don't see the benefit. If you look at visual acuity studies, and okay, I have very thick glasses. I have terrible vision. So don't use me as an example, but somebody has 20/20 vision, like, basically perfect, or at least typical vision. With 4,000 pixels across the front of the screen, if you're sitting at an equilateral triangle that is defined by the edges of the screen and where you sit, so you're the same distance to each edge of the screen as the screen is wide, and you have 4,000 pixels, you cannot see pixels, period. Now, if you get closer to the screen, then maybe you can start seeing pixels. But if you have 20/20 vision and you're subtending a 60-degree screen angle, you can't see any pixels. So why do you need twice as many? You're not going to be able to see it unless you're putting your nose on the screen. What I'd be more interested in seeing is better contrast, better color gamut, HDR. There are a lot of things other than just the number of pixels that can give you a better picture. And personally, I'd be much more interested in upping the game in those areas. There's the fact is that a lot of the 4K content that's available now looks fantastic. And I just don't see, when it's done well, there's no lack of resolution that I can perceive. So I'm sure there are going to be a lot of 8K TVs sold, and there's going to be a lot of demand for 2.1 just because people, it's a bigger number, so people will assume it's better. But I am not convinced. And one thing I am convinced of based on experience is that, it's going to cause all kinds of headaches. Because, think of going from 1080p to 4K and how much more difficult it was to get cables that actually worked reliably. And now you're going to go to 8K, and it's only going to get worse. Yeah, one of my one of my colleagues in the R&D department refers to HDMI as the hastily defined malfunctioning interface, which is pretty good, I think.
Does this new bass feature will it benefit seats like his theater with only two main seats?
Oh yeah, yeah. It really. I mean, one of the big advantages is if you have a bigger listening area, everybody in the listening area is hearing the same thing at low frequencies. But
Right.
even if it's just a couple people, you're still hearing a lot of detail in the sound that you can't hear when the sound is bouncing around for half a second before it settles down, right? I don't remember who it was, but one of the member of the press, after he saw our demo or heard our demo in Barcelona, described it as, he had high expectations for the thing based on what he had read about it or whatever. But what he didn't expect was the effect of, and this is his description, not mine. He said, it felt like I was getting punched in the throat. I mean, the bass had that kind of impact, and it was just unsettling for him at first because he'd never heard bass like that before. But yeah, the transient detail, if you think about it, with reproduced sound, let's say you're talking about a symphony orchestra in a great concert hall. One of the reasons the great concert hall sounds so great is that, the way it handles all that reverberant energy. And again, it may be very rich and lush, but it's treating everything pretty similarly. Well, wouldn't you like to be able to hear what somebody who is sitting, in the sixth row center of that concert hall heard? You can't hear that if your room is actually dominating what's happening at low frequencies, because you're hearing what's in the recording, but then overlaid on top of that is all of the nonsense that's bouncing around in the room. We're trying to eliminate all of the bouncy stuff in the room so you can actually hear better what's in the recording, which makes everything sound that much more real.
So for those spaces like your theater there, that's going to have a couple of 21s and then one infra sub. How does that work? How does it take that infra sub into the equation there, since you've only got one?
Well, without getting into too many details, because I think we still have more to learn in this regard. One of the reasons why, when you're doing, multi-sub optimizer, MSO kind of arrangements, you are putting the subs in very specific locations based on the simulation in REW or however you do it. Putting the subs in specific locations, you're setting them up just so, and the idea is to make sure that all the different standing waves that each of those subs is being, the room is doing different things to all of those subs based on the fact that they're in different parts of the room. And the idea is to sort of average everything out so that no matter where you sit, it's, pretty close to the same. And the way that works is that there's just a whole lot of stuff bouncing around, so it kind of can average out. Below a certain frequency, based on the longest dimension of the room, so like the Connecticut Theater that we're building here, the longest dimension is 23 feet long, and I've done the math. So the lowest frequency standing wave that room can support is at 24.5 hertz. So let's call it 25, or close enough for government work. So anything that's below, in this case, about 25 hertz, is unaffected by standing waves, because the waves are just so long that the only thing they can do in the room is pressurize the room rather than bouncing back and forth in it. And that's where the infrasonic stuff comes in, is that it's the bass that you feel because the room is being pressurized. It literally is, higher pressure, lower pressure, higher pressure, lower pressure, at fewer than, in this case, say 25 changes per second, and you feel that, and when that's harmonically related to what you're hearing with your ears, because it's subharmonics of whatever, it takes on a whole different level of immersion, because now it's like I'm hearing and feeling something that is of a piece, and it's really gets your adrenaline going. It's a fight or flight kind of thing. So I guess the short answer is we will have to figure out ways to have our cake and eat it too. Because, for example, if we had infrasonic capable subs, both front and rear, below that lowest frequency standing wave in the room, what you want is for this, not for that. This is how you send a wave and then catch it on the other side, right? But that's not going to pressurize the room. That's just going to move the air around. What you want below a certain frequency is squeezing the room. And that frequency depends on the size of the room. So it's yet another problem. Just like Floyd was talking about the transition frequency between kind of what works in the mid-range and up and what works in the low frequencies. There's another transition frequency below the standing wave range of your room that you can take advantage of with infrasonics.
Will this be what's the minimum number of measurements you're gonna have to need when this rolls out?
Oh, we're at ISC we did, I think it was 20. You don't need to do 96. We've demonstrated that to our own satisfaction. It'll depend a little bit on the size of the room. If you have a larger room, probably you'll need a few more measurements. But for most of the good size but not enormous theaters, it's probably about 20 measurements.
Oh, okay. And this will all be part of just the regular optimizer measurement process.
It's a different test signal. I mean, if you wanted to get really fancy, you could set up a multi-mic thing, but realistically, most people are not going to do that. So you'll just take our regular 3D microphone and move it, one here, one there, one the next, and then move it forward. And then, once you do enough this way, then you move it up a layer and repeat. So, it'll be a little bit tedious, but it goes pretty fast because each test tone was only a few seconds long. I don't remember exactly how long. But
the only problem I see with that one is getting everything nice and level. So if you're doing the upper ones, everything's still got to be nice and level, or what?
Well, I haven't actually been involved in it yet. I had the process described to me, but I think you'd want some degree of precision. But you can buy those little laser levels at a hardware store for like $10 now.
Yeah.
And so you just set it at a certain height, and then you make sure that that laser is hitting the mic capsule for all the measurements you do at that height, and then you move it up another meter and you do it again.
Yeah.
So I don't think it'll be too hard.
It's always fun trying to get that level in my place. Oh, and one more thing. You guys had recently released the app for iOS. Is there any plans for Android?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
we hired someone about a year ago now, I think, who's been working on the iOS app. We're also working on a Mac OS version and a Windows OS version, an Android version. And the same guy is conversant in all of that kind of programming. But I mean, there are more than one person working on this, but the main coding effort, as I understand it, is this one guy. So there's only so much he can do at one time.
And
But it's coming.
okay, so right now it's kind of bare bones, kind of basic. I like that you guys integrated the like the main page from the web UI in there. Is the more advanced menu going to be in there as well?
I don't see. I mean, this was really designed as a better remote control than the one we include in the box. I'm not a big fan of our remote control. It's pretty lame, I think. But the iOS app is really cool, and I was involved in beta testing it, and I use it all the time now. It's great. It gives me. It's designed and intended to give you all the day-to-day operational stuff that you would want once you set up the system. But the system itself, there's enough complexity in what can be done depending on what problems you run into, that that's going to stay, sort of a web-based or VNC-based operation.
Gotcha.
Because if only because your phone's only this big. Right? Do you really want to try to do all that really
Man,
tiny stuff?
for the
I
iPad
wouldn't want
users,
to.
the iPad guys, come on.
Yeah. Well, I use an iPad for a lot of that stuff,
Yeah.
but even there, some of the interface is still fairly small. We're working on that too, but that's a different story.
Question from Johnny Sandoval. Will the power on off be available on the app?
Hmm. I don't know.
It should be.
The reactions to the app so far are, "Oh my God, this is great!" And when are we going to have power on off? So
Yeah.
I we hear you loud and clear.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why that would be more difficult. I mean, control systems use wake on LAN and just IP control for that sort of thing, and that's what the iOS app is doing. So I have to think that it will at some point, but I am not enough of a programmer to really warrant having an opinion.
Ba, 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 ba. Is it a good time to buy a Trinnov in December this year? In Sweden, it is like 22K and 40% of my yearly payment. No upgrades ahead? I
Well,
mean,
we do software upgrades all the
yeah,
time, but those are free.
yeah.
The only real hardware upgrade will be HDMI 2.1 when the time comes. And it's not actually official, but we did just put out a price list to our dealers. So starting in the middle of next month, there is a price increase. I'm sorry that some of the parts that are in the altitude are stupid expensive compared to what they used to be.
Hmm.
There's one in particular that's really quite critical. That used to be about $5 each, and it's now over $120 each if you can find them. And we use two of those in every altitude 32. So I mean, it's stuff like that that we just kind of took it on the chin for a while, hoping that things would settle down after the pandemic. And
Yeah.
there are a few cases where it has a little bit, but nothing's really gone back to where it was.
Yeah. I mean, if
Which
they're making money charging that much money, why would they bring it back down? They're selling.
Yeah, it's nasty. But one of the things we're doing to sort of soften the blow is anybody who buys an altitude after April 15th, which is when this new price list goes into effect, will in effect get a coupon for a free HDMI 2.1 upgrade kit when it's available. I can't
Hey,
tell you when it'll be available, but we are committing to doing that
nice.
just because yeah, everybody asks the same questions, and I'm getting tired of answering them. So this will be an easier answer. Just buy one, and we'll take care of you as soon as it's available.
And is it possible to make groups of subs instead of one per channel per sub? For example, the upper and lower row of a classical DBA.
It is certainly possible, but it's the individual, autonomy of the different subs that allows us to move the sound this way or that way or up or down. So yes, you can do it, but it will limit how much we can work with, how much we can do. So if, for example, if let's say you have an altitude 16 and you only have an extra, I don't know, you have 6 channels that aren't being used that you could use. Our preference would be, a triangle of 3 in the front and a triangle of 3 in the back. But if you only had 4 extra channels with the +4 software that we had issued, that's another example of the software updates being free. The Altitude 16 can now actually decode and render 20 channels, not 16. And that was a free software update that we provided over a year ago now. But through using the +4 software, people who originally had a 16-channel unit now have a 20-channel unit. If they want to run 4 subs in the front and 4 subs in the back, but it's really just a group of 2, and then the same thing on the back wall, that will be possible, but it limits the amount that we can do side to side, right? Because
Hmm.
it's all up and down.
Yeah. I suppose it would be an issue having ported and sealed subs.
Well, I have never been happy with a mixture of those two in the same. No, that's not true. I did hear one system where it worked really well, but I've never been able to do that personally. I find that you can get really good sound with ported subs. You can get really good sound with sealed subs, and when you mix and match the group delay characteristics, which are very, very different, just make it really hard to get everything to sing from the same page of the hymnal.
Hmm. Yeah, I figure so. Well, I think that's it. Anything else interesting here? Cables. I think this is an easy one. How many channels are this new feature take if you use 8 subs?
Normally, it would be 8 channels.
Yeah, 8 channels, my
Yeah,
man.
yeah,
I mean, the cool thing is you
yeah.
guys did
Mhm.
release that 4 subwoofer additional upgrade. So I mean, you got whatever you got hooked up
Yeah,
now, an extra
everybody.
4.
Yeah, everybody has access to an extra 4 if they haven't already taken advantage of them. Um, this will. I mean, this is an ambitious thing, and it's just not everybody, and most people will not go to this length. They're not going to rebuild
Yeah.
their entire theater to accommodate all this, and we get that. But again, we set out to see what was possible, not to see what we could do for no money. And the idea is that you aim high, and then hopefully things trickle down. Um, but you can't find out what's possible unless you aim for, you know, what's possible. Um,
Hmm.
so that's where we're starting, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of trickle down from all this research because there's a lot of information now within the company. Um, but for the foreseeable future, it is going to mean more subwoofers, somewhat more complex arrangement, just because you know have these in-wall subs or whatever you decide to use. It's not going to be for everybody, but for the people who are a little bit more ambitious and want to take the time and the trouble to see what's possible, it deliver the difference is not subtle. I can tell you that. You'll
Right.
hear it immediately.
Wow.
In fact, it's almost initially a little bit disorienting
Hmm.
because most of us have never heard anything like this. The closest thing to it, which is awfully hard to come by, would be a super high quality, like audiophile quality PA system, like outdoors.
Right.
And I actually heard um, the Pink Floyd system. It was in Northern Ireland and like back in 1982, and it was a folk concert. And they rented. Pink Floyd was famous for having the most amazing, super loud system and staging and everything. And Pink Floyd was not performing at this, but they rented the Pink Floyd system for this folk festival I was attending, and it was amazing. It was some of the best sound I'd ever heard. And a big part of that was the fact that there were no walls. You heard everything once and then it just kept going. And so the clarity, the detail, the impact, all of that was totally different than what we're used to in our living rooms.
And this has no effect on infrasonics or anything like that? Will we still get like single digits, or is that going to get wiped out or
Can
something?
can do. That's still to be determined exactly how.
Mm.
But we're working with some of the folks who do that sort of thing, and you have close relationships with those guys.
Yeah.
So
Well, all right, John. Thanks, guys, for hanging out with us today. Thanks for your questions, and again, thanks, John, for explaining how all this works and when
okay,
we can be expecting it. Probably next year, hopefully end of the year.
yeah,
And guys, thanks for watching. If you guys have any questions, just email John. And if you want to pick up a Trinnov Altitude anytime soon, get it before April. April what? Before the price goes up.
the April 15 is when the price goes up, but that's also when you get the coupon for a free HDMI 2.1 board. So it's kind of a wash.
Yeah. All right.
What yeah.
Well, get your altitude soon then, or not. But
Okay.
thanks for watching, guys.